So I'm going to be lining these 4 trays with felt, just this inside bottom portion here. And the first step in that is making sure that you've got a nice sharp blade. So I'm going to do a little sharpening on this marking knife that I use for cutting felt. And the next thing to do, since I'm only doing the very bottom of these, I'm going to line the inside edges, sides with some masking tape. And this doesn't have to be, 100% all the way against the bottom because of the thickness of the felt, but I do want to try to get it as close as possible. So mark out the length of it real quick. It'd be easier to get these pieces in if they're not over long. Okay, let me check that compared to the felt. Yeah, that'll be good. And the long sides, I'm going to actually wrap around the corners just to make sure there's no gapping at all in there. So I'm using the back of this marking knife just to press the tape into the corner there. And even though this bottom will be covered in felt, I'm trying not to do any scratching of the finish with the tip of the knife. Dog hair. Get this in here. So I'm taking the back. This is probably really loud. I'm taking the back of the marking knife, slide in, press and rotate. That gets a nice crisp corner. At least with this kind of marking knife, it's got one straight edge, just one blade section here, and then a straight back. It's not a double-edged marking knife. Oh, that was a little loose. And I mean, I guess it's fairly obvious, but the reason I'm doing this is so I don't get contact cement up on the sides and make them sticky, or end up having to do the work of removing it, because removing contact cement is kind of a pain in the butt. Make sure they're all nice and well sealed. It's humid in here. And what I use is just this DAP gel style contact cement, and then a cheap chip brush, so I can just throw it away, because there's not really any good way to clean all the contact cement out of a brush. I've tried with a brush cleaner, and it just, you know, the stuff's too thick. It stays up in the back end of the brush. So if you're using these cheap brushes, make sure you clean out loose bristles, because they usually have a lot of them. And you don't want that getting stuck in the cement before you start. Just stir this up, get it nice and loose. Before I start on the contact cement, I'm actually going to cut the felt to size. So, trade places. There are a few ways to do this. I'm sure if you've got a fabric cutter, it's probably a little easier than using a marking knife. Take the straight edge or tape measure, butt it up against one end, and so this is just under 16 3/4 in here. So I'm going to make it about 16 and what do we have here? 16 and about 11/16. Go slightly shy of the full length, and part of that's the fact that fabric can stretch a little bit into the empty space. So 16, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11/16. Just slice right through there. All I'm doing is just pressing straight down with the knife. It'll cut right through the fabric, no problem, as long as it's nice and sharp. I'm going to take the measurement in the other direction real quick. I've got almost exactly 6 inches. So what I'll do for this is take just barely under 6 inches here. Make one mark at the end of this. One mark at the end like that. And then do another one up here, the same size. And that'll give me a nice straight line to work to. It's sometimes hard to see your marks, but if you kind of remember where you put them, here, here, and you just line up your straight edge on those 2 marks. You can do, this is something I learned from Paul Sellers just for woodworking. If you put your marking knife in your mark, you can then butt your straight edge or whatever measuring tool you're using up against it, and that'll give you an essentially perfect registration. Alright, make sure the fabric is pulled fairly taut. Line yourself up. Press down really hard on the straight edge, and you want to move your hand as you do it. One thing you can do is kind of use your knife, use your blade, oopsie, as a sort of scissor, and just kind of press down through the fabric if you want to do it that way. Another thing you can do is just slide along a few times, softly, getting a little bit more firm each time. I find the kind of press through method gives a cleaner cut. I guess it kind of works like a fabric cutter when you do this. Yeah, nice clean line. But this should be just about the perfect width for this. It's actually a little bit too wide up on this end, up on this end up here. So I will take off just a sliver. And that was probably due to just the felt being a little bit, you know, curled up. Right now I'm just cleaning up any spots that are sticking out from that second cut. Anything that's not quite straight. Because when you're trying to cut off just a tiny bit, the fabric tends to play a little bit more. This is going to be good. I usually try to get about a 1/16 inch shy. And then the next cut, I've already got one of my marks here, 16 and 11/16, so I'll do another one real quick. Pull it, stretch it a tiny bit. 16, 9, 10, 11/16. That's what that was. Double check myself. Yeah. And 11/16. Put a little hole in there. Same thing. I got my slice here, and my little hole is too small. Do it again. Stretch it out a tiny bit. 8, 9, 10, 11. I can actually feel the knife in the hole, the original hole right there. There we go. That one's visible. Marking knife, butt it up. Butt it up. Slash, 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 slash. Clean. afraid. Okay, pretty good fit. Length. Actually, I feel like I'm a little bit too long, so I'm going to take off a sliver from one of the ends, just eyeballing it. About a 1/16 of an inch or so. Probably a little more than a 1/16 actually. Okay, that's good. Now it's got a little stretch. All right. Make sure you've got a fairly clean, lint-free surface. Contact cement. You don't need it thick in the box itself. So you just put some on there, spread it around until it looks essentially clear. A bit of lint there. Just keep going until you've got everything covered with a thin coating of contact cement. Make sure you get up into the corners really good, because it can tend to miss. You know, on big flat surfaces that don't have edges, I'd use a roller to apply the contact cement for like veneering. But with something like this, it can't get into the corners, and it puts more risk of getting stuff up on the edges. Okay, there's that. Let that dry. And on the felt, you want to use quite a lot, because the felt will kind of soak some of it in. You got to kind of press it in to the fabric in order to kind of saturate this side of it. Being fairly careful to not get a ton of contact cement on your surface underneath the felt, because then it'll get on the top and be a little bit unsightly. So both trying to get as little on the table as possible, and also trying to make sure the felt slides as little as possible. And then I usually, once I'm, I get to there, and I'll slide it down away from where I've been working to try to get the felt away from the wet stuff on the desk. Here. It's not wanting to saturate right there. Alright, I'm going to switch to another spot on the table here for the other portion of the felt. Sorry if I'm out of view. Make sure you got lots of contact cement in the fibers of the fabric, so that it's not just a really thin few fibers up on the surface holding it down. You want to kind of make sure you've got lots of contact between the fabric and the wood, That should be good. Stick the brush back in the contact cement can so it doesn't dry out. Check this side. I don't see any contact cement on it. This needs to dry for a few minutes. Since you put so much on the fabric, let's see if we can see this. You can see it looks like it's wet. You want to wait until essentially the whole thing appears to be dry. And that's when you put it down in the tray, in the box, whatever you're lining. Lay a towel down just so I can move the tray over here without risking getting any of the contact cement from the table onto the underside of it. You can tell the contact cement's ready when you can touch it and it's just barely tacky. It can even be pretty much completely dry and it'll still work. The felt here, it's still pretty wet in the center, so I'm going to give it another couple of minutes. What I use for pressing the felt, I have this Junker plane blade. I just use the bevel. Use this side of the bevel to actually press the felt down, because then you can get all the way up into the corners, and you can also use it to press the fabric up against the edges. So you don't want to try to start in the center, because it seems reasonable that you could do, fold your cloth in half, set it down, and flop it out in both directions. And you can do that if you're doing, a flat surface and your veneer or felt is bigger than the surface itself by a fairly substantial amount. But with something like this, where you're actually trying to press something up into the corners, a little piece of grit, where you're trying to press something up into the corners, you want to actually start on an edge. So I take my hand, set it under the felt, and then butt this edge up against the back here. Edge, adjust, and the fabric's pliability, I guess you could say, also means you don't have to have it perfectly square to get a good fit. Okay, that's good there. Taking my knife, my marking knife, putting it back a little behind where I want the edge to meet up, and just sliding forward, using the back of the bevel as a nice soft edge to slide up into there with. Press it down, rotating in order to make sure the very edge of the felt is very well sealed to the wood. Now here, you can see I've got this big bump, but that I can just work out up against the side here like this, and then do the same thing. Make sure my sides are pressed all the way firm up against the edges. This is a lot like veneering, except, with wood veneer, you don't get very much stretch out of it. So I'm pressing very firmly downward, just sliding up to the edge until I don't see any gap between the fabric and the edge. Oh, hit the tape there a little bit. Close those gaps. And then once I've got the felt up against, nice and tight against the sides of the piece, not sure how well you can see this. See if I can get a nice close-up of it. I'm taking my old plane blade, sliding the bevel up. This is how I'm getting it to the edge. Just pressing, 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 and sliding over and over. And then once I have it on the edge, I put the knife against the edge and just roll it up so that the bevel presses the fabric edge down into the corners. That gives it a cleaner look, and kind of presses any fibers against the edges here so that it's got an extra tight hold. Yeah, just go backwards. Try to remove any kind of lumpiness that might be in anywhere. So I'm pretty sure I've got the edges nice and tight now. We'll see later once we take the tape off. Pretty good.